Test, 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 test. Sounds like it's catching.
Okay. And then once it's a little bit quieter,
Okay.
I'm gonna turn it off for now, save our battery.
Hello? Okay. So, good evening. We're going to start in about 15 minutes. So, if you're in the hallway getting refreshments, if you could finish those up and come on into the auditorium. Also, if you're in the auditorium and you feel inclined, if you could move up so that we have seats for the people that might be coming after you. We think that we're going to have a pretty full house. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening again. We're going to start in about 5 minutes. So if you're outside, if you could make your way in and come into the auditorium so we can start at 7. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Can you give me another one? Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you all for braving the rain to get here for our very special guest, Dr. David Stovall. My name is Stella Smith. I'm the Associate Director for the Mach 3 Center, the Minority Achievement, Creativity, and High Ability Center here at Prairie View A&M University. And I am very pleased to be able to preside over this event. And again, our featured speaker is Dr. David Stovall, and his presentation is titled, The Radical Project of Resistance and Resilience, Love and Self-Care in Troubling Times. So I'd like to start off with 3 items, just housekeeping items. First, please put your cell phone or whatever other technology you have on silent or vibrate. We're live streaming this presentation, so not only will you be shamed in here, but it's all over the web. So if you could please put your device on silent or vibrate, just in respect of the speakers. Secondly, we do encourage you to use those devices to tweet or Facebook post about what you're learning in this space. If you could hashtag Mach3 on those posts, that would be helpful so that we can gather information about your thoughts about this presentation. And third, part of the time that Dr. Stovall will be speaking is a discussion period. So if you have questions and thoughts throughout his presentation, please hold those, and we'll have time for a robust discussion about his presentation towards the end of the program. With all those items shared, we are going to begin the program. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Charles Luter IV, Dean of Chapel, Johnson Philip All Faiths Chapel, to give the invocation.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Good. Benjamin Franklin once said, if a man empties his purse into his head, no one can take it away from him. An investment in knowledge always pays the best interests. Let us pray. We thank you, O Sovereign One, for this occasion, an evening filled with empowerment and liberation. We ask that our hearts and our ears will be receptive to experience spoken word of truth that will encourage our students, faculty, and staff to fulfill their educational goals. Bless the speaker and his powerful words of wisdom this evening. Thank you, Creator, for the vision of the Mach 3 Center, and continue to bless its leader, the team, and all that are assembled here this evening. In the name of the one who gives us life, health, and strength. And let us all say, amen.
Amen. I'll show you.
Thank you, Dean Luter. Let's give him a round of applause, please. Now, if you'll please join me in welcoming Miss Sine Davis. She's a music education major, and she's going to sing the Black National Anthem.
Oh.
Lift every voice and sing. And we're just singing the first stanza.
All right.
May you all stand.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have another round of applause for Ms. Davis? Thank you again. Thank you for sharing your incredible talent with us. So next on the program is greetings from Dr. Nave. Unfortunately, she was not able to be with us today due to a family conflict. So Dr. Serena Phillips, Associate Provost for Academic Affairs, will bring greetings on her behalf. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Phillips.
Good evening, and thank you for attending tonight's second installment of the Building on Resilience Lecture Series, hosted by the Mach 3 Center here at Prairie View A&M University. My name is Dr. Serena Phillips, and I serve as the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs, and I have the honor of bringing you greetings on behalf of Dr. Felicia M. Nave, who has the pleasure of serving as the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here on the Hill. Right off the bat, as I look out into the audience, I see we have PV students, faculty, and staff members here tonight. Thank you for being here and supporting the Mach 3 Center in this wonderful event they have put on for us. I also want to thank our representatives here from any local school districts and also our colleagues who are joining us from other institutions of higher education. Thank you for spending your Thursday Eve with us, and we hope you will be encouraged by today's installment to really get involved and stay involved with research and scholarship. To our guest speaker, Dr. David Stovall. He came all the way to little old Prairie View, Texas from Chicago, Illinois. We want to thank him for being here and for serving as tonight's guest speaker. Dr. Stovall is a professor of Educational Policy Studies and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I anticipate his talk will be both insightful and powerful as he speaks on the radical project of resistance and resilience, love and self-care in troubling times. Really quickly, I want to go over what the Mach 3 Center is all about for anyone who may be unfamiliar. Mach 3 stands for Minority Achievement, Creativity, and High Ability. And over the years, it has cultivated events such as this one to accomplish its mission and vision, which is becoming the epicenter for research and scholarship for diverse populations, especially at minority-serving institutions. The goal of the Mach 3 Center, under the direction of Dr. Fred Bonner, is to produce cutting-edge research and the best practices which speak to contemporary issues that many face today. The purpose of the current series, and really the overarching goal of the center, is to elevate the research profile here at Prairie View A&M University. Of course, research is one of the university's core missions, along with teaching and service. So we cannot emphasize how important this center is. I encourage you to take notes and take in everything you can this evening. When you leave tonight, I hope you will be more enriched and empowered than ever before and ready to take on the world in a new light. Please make yourselves at home. And again, on behalf of Dr. Felicia Nave, thank you for being here and supporting our great university.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phillips. Now, please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Fred A. Bonner, the Executive Director, Architect, Research Scientist, and Visionary behind the Mach 3 Center. Dr. Bonner is Provost and Endowed Chair in Educational Leadership and Counseling here at Prairie View A&M University. He's the author of the recently released book, Building on Resilience, Models and Frameworks of Black Male Success Across the P through 20 Pipeline, which is the inspiration for this lecture series. Audience, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fred Bonner to share a little more about Mach 3 Center, about the Mach 3 Center, and to introduce our speaker.
Good evening.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you all for being here. This is a landmark crowd. And I shared with my good friend, Dr. David Stovall. I have had him to speak at several different venues. Wherever I go, I'm like, Stovall, you got to come and speak. And I thought we did a great thing by having a population of about 45, 50 at Rutgers. We have more than triple that here at Prairie View. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your participation, for coming out, and for being here to hear this dynamic speaker. So very quickly, just want to share with you, Dr. Phillips has given you the overarching view, overarching perspective of the Mach 3 Center, what we're doing, why we're here, and what this space is all about. But very, very quickly, I just want to share with you the elements that all hang together to make Mach 3 what it is. And again, Mach 3, minority, achievement, creativity, and high ability. And one of the things that I've wanted to do with my research agenda, with my life in this space, in the academic space, I've done at Prairie View, what I've done at Rutgers, what I've done at Texas A&M. That is to foreground the assets and the things that we do as African Americans that are about giftedness and about talents and about creativity. Because so often we're trapped in that deficit perspective. We're not successful, we're not doing well. So I'm tired of the knots. Mach 3 is about getting rid of, moving to the side, moving past, transcending the knots. We're going to talk about the cans, the can-dos, the things that we're doing well. So with that said, the Mach 3 Center is comprised of these strategic areas of focus. The very first one, Vector 1, is minority, academic achievement, giftedness, and high achievement. So again, that is to move the needle away from the deficit perspective and to look at the assets that we have in our community. So what are we bringing? Again, the narrative of we're not doing. Many of you, all of you, come from family, come from backgrounds where you have mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, grandmothers, uncles, aunts who have done well. So we need to tell that narrative some of the time. Vector 3, minority success in STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We have to move the needle in this country, not just for our white populations, for our white students. We also have to look at what it means to be successful as a person of color. So I say the recently released movie, Hidden Figures, there are a lot of hidden figures in our very contemporary society, and we need to uncover who those people are. And that's what Mach 3 is doing, trying to foreground all of those people, all of that black brilliance that's in the background. Vector 4, college and university faculty and faculty development. One of the things that we have to do is to improve and to look at critical ways to advance the faculty in minority serving institutions. And we use the term in higher ed, MSIs. MSI, Minority Serving Institution, that stands for, it represents HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, and now in contemporary context, MSIs are also community colleges, two-year institutions. So it is very, very important for us to understand what is going on in these institutions. And I've said before in my research that if you truly are going to understand what is right by way of minority education, you have to go where we are. As a higher education scholar, I'm very, very aware that the literature says that the majority of black and brown people in this country are in community colleges. Yep. There is no way we can ignore these institutions. So Mach 3 is focusing on community colleges, two-year institutions, and really trying to foreground what they are doing in these spaces to ensure that African Americans are being successful. One of the latest grants we're working on is looking at the pipeline, moving African American males from middle school to high school to community college to HBCU STEM program. So that's just one of the many initiatives that we have. So Vector 5, Higher Education and Student Affairs. So as a higher education and student affairs scholar, I thought it very, very critical and very, very important to understand what we're doing on the academic affairs side of the house and what we're doing on the student affairs side of the house. My scholars in student affairs will tell you it's about understanding the whole student. So how do we do that? And we need to know that that whole student comes in a lot of different packages. I had an article several years ago called Extraordinary Gifts Come in Plain Brown Wrappers. So we need to look at those brown wrappers, those black wrappers, those yellow wrappers, those red wrappers to see who these students are in our institutions. And then finally, the last vector, Vector 6, business and corporate partnerships. So we plan to connect with the Luminas of the world, the Monsantos, the Shells, the Houston Endowments. It's really, really important to foreground the work that we're doing here at Mach 3 and the work that's going on at Prairie View. And as I've said before, I am a scholar, I'm a black scholar, who's been doing this critical work on populations of color in higher ed. And I think, what better place to do this type of work than being in a place like Prairie View? So it's really, really important for us to make those linkages and to connect to corporate and business partners. So that's another area of focus. So with that said, I just want to, a few thank yous to Provost Nave. She was one of the architects of the Mach 3 Center, of actually helping to secure the funding to even get the Mach 3 Center going. And I want to thank Dr. Phillips for standing in, dear friend and really great colleague. I want to thank Lindsey Dixon. So one of our graduate students, he has marshaled numerous students. Many of you are in Mr. Dixon's class, so we appreciate you being here. A special thank you to the folks in academic technology, because there are several people that I connect with, many on Facebook, and everybody's like, Bonner, I can't get to Prairie View, but you have got to live stream this stuff. You've got to record it. We've got to have a way to be able to see this, if we can't get there. So, and I will tell you, all of you, we are working on our webpage. So the university is working on the webpage. So we can't quite do anything until the university kind of pulls us in. So webpage is coming. So everything you see, everything you hear is eventually going to be archived there. So, but for now, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter eventually. So I would also like to thank our volunteers, Ms. Charlene Stubblefield, Lori Proctor, and Shonda Whetstone, Tammy Lane. In addition to that, several of my colleagues in educational leadership, just in the College of Education, I see Dr. Butler back there, Dr. Tanner, Dr. Booker and Dr. Parker. I cannot say enough about the two of them. They have I call Dr. Parker the godfather, so I'm going to call Dr. Booker the godmother. So they really look out for me, and they really, really look out for Mach 3. So much appreciated. So all of you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I just want you to know, we can't have events like this unless we have you here. And it's so important for you to be here. And I want you to think of the Mach 3 Center as a place that you can always contact, you can always go to advance your research. We're here. We're all working on research projects. We have multiple grants going. So the next time you're sitting and thinking, I have this research idea, what should I do with it? Contact Mach 3. We will help you move it along. So with that said, I will get off the stage. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, wait, before I do, hold on. Dr. Stella's like, speaker. My good buddy and good friend, Dr. David Stovall. And let me say a few words about Dr. Stovall. So Dr. Stovall, Dr. Phillips, she gave you his credentials, and he has a litany of publications. And when I think about Dr. Stovall, I think about one of his most impactful works, well, the work that has impacted me the most, the Handbook of Social Justice. Now, whether you know it or not, That is an amazing thing, to be able to sit in a room and sit in a space with the man who is credited with writing, developing, co-editing, co-authoring the Handbook of Social Justice. So with that said, Dr. Stovall, he has three main areas of concentration: critical race theory, which looks at the relationship between, he also looks at the relationship between housing, education, and the intersection of race, place, and school. In the attempt to bring theory to action, he works with community organizations and schools to develop curriculum that addresses issues of equity and social justice. His work led him to become a member of the Greater Lawndale Little Village School of Social Work and Social Justice. And furthering his work in communities, he works with teachers, students, and his work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement. And this movement is a collection of classroom teachers, community activists, students, and university professors in the Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco Bay Area. All of these teachers, they engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition, his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also serves as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice. So with that said, I welcome Dr. David Stovall to the stage.
Appreciate you. Peace and greetings, y'all. Everybody all right? I got this mic thing happening. It's hella loud. So my apologies initially for that. And to the Reverend, hopefully my comments tonight do not bring a streak of lightning down to strike me. Right, because we often engage, I often tell folks, my English is limited, so a lot of curse words come out, right? So this thing around, because we just have to be intentional about the work that we do, and sometimes that intentionality is intense. And I want to thank the administrators for actually, and the Mark III Center and Dr. Fred Bonner for bringing me here, because usually, and you probably can tell after my comments, that I'm usually uninvited to come to places more so than I'm invited, right? So one love to the folks at Prairie View A&M for bringing me to the spot. And I also want to make knowledge of a Chicagoan who came here and changed the lens of how we understand the current moment, a sister by the name of Sandra Bland. And as she was actually, her space was dedicated to her. And when she came here to work because of the mission of Prairie View A&M, they took her away from us. And I think it's important to understand that particular moment as part of this larger thing that we talk about in terms of our lives. And I want to thank the sister for singing the Black National Anthem. And I'll date myself, right? Because I went to a grade school that literally in the morning, it wasn't no flag business happening. We sang the Black National Anthem, all three verses. Right? And so as soon as she walked up to the stage, in my head, I was instantly conditioned to just go, whoop. Like I automatically stood flat. And we sang the Black National Anthem and we faced east. Right? And our teacher said we face east to remember where we came from. Right? And I was like, man, that was in our day-to-day. Right? So this thing around where do we now start to think? And I also want to take a moment to recognize the indigenous folks who rest their bodies and souls in this land, in this place sometimes referred to as Tejas. Right? Whose names we never call, right? Whose bodies also rest and fertilize this land, right? And I always want to thank the Chicago family who came from College Station, the good brother C.J. Harmon. Because I know that trek, I hope they treat me all right in College Station. I've been there. It's a real situation, right? That's all you can say about College Station. You out there, the sidewalks disappear. You like, hey, right? It's a weird, if it go, and it's, as Chicagoans, we think it's like, look, if they taking me, they gonna take me, but I'm taking two, right? And that's just how it is, right? So this thing around at Prairie View, and I didn't realize this, y'all. Y'all played J-State this weekend. I didn't realize Prairie View was in the SWAC. And I'm like, I'm tripping. I'm like, damn, Prairie View is in the SWAC. Couple of my guys came here in the early 90s to play football. And I remember them, and now started to think in their head, they used to come back to Chicago, and they would always say this statement. They would like, Stovall, it's tight in the SWAC. And I was like, damn, right? And I went to this lily white college, so they would bring back, and these were like, they would bring back videos. The band was fresh. I'm like, damn, where am I, right? I was like, look, folks, Kate is righteous. I'm like, man, this is terrible where I'm at. Right, so I'm living vicariously through y'all in the SWAC, right? So let's get into this, because I think in a lot of ways, we think about this particular moment in ways that often are much more immediate, and they become these moments that get us into a crisis moment. And I'm more concerned about that crisis moment because when we operate from the crisis moment, we don't operate from an understanding of what work is to be done, right? So we have to say this in very explicit terms, and I want us to be clear. So for folk in the Mock Center, when y'all get hit with all the random Twitter sphere madness from the live stream or what have you, I said it, right? And I'm going to start off with it. So when the ops come, they know where I'm at, right? Because in this particular moment, let's get down to the crux of this thing. America is only being what it has always been, right? And this is the thing. We get into this moment like this some panic thing. No, 45 is just a manifestation of what this thing has been, right? It's nothing new. Right? And this thing around now, it's intensified and now have folks panic stricken. But if we just do a little bit of history, we'll see what this thing is. Right? And now in this moment, when we talk about it and we see just the dumb maniacal stuff that's happening, that a dude is letting people die in Puerto Rico and he got beef with the NFL. Right? Almost washed y'all away with Harvey. He got beef about whether or not he can fire the dude who's investigating him, right? So now you got a president who's petty, right? And for all y'all who voted for him, you got what you paid for, right? And this thing around now thinking about it in particular ways, because at this moment, we're at a crux. We're at a moment where we often have to recognize what this trauma really is, right? But we think about in the United States, with all our new social media, we think about history as 5 minutes ago. But history deeply impacts everything that we do. My grandmother passed away this summer at 100 years old, right? And when we watched the election of Barack Hussein Obama, and all my students ran to Grant Park, they ran from my class straight to Grant Park, and because I don't work too far away, so they didn't even take the bus. They ran, right? Got in Grant Park, and I went to my grandmother's house. And I remember my grandmother watching the television, and one of the ABC newscasters, his last name was Wilson. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Barack Obama is the 44th president of the United States." And everybody in my grandmother's house, they clapping. Ah! And my grandmother's just sitting there. She looked at me, she said, what are you going to do with that one? And I was like, oh, Grandma, you a G. And because what she was, and what she said after that even stuck with me even more. She said, well, child, they only give it to you when it's broke. And I was like, damn, Grandma, damn. Right? But the thing that she's putting forward is we got to pay attention to what's happening. And when we get caught in the fanfare of the first, we don't see what is affecting the many. And when we don't pay attention to what's affecting the many, now we start to engage in these things that continue to tear us down without a particular understanding of this is a historical manifestation. It does not come out of the woodwork. If you want to understand more about 45, all you got to do is study Andrew Jackson. Right? When Andrew Jackson talked about a trail of tears, and when Andrew Jackson actually approved of moving and relocating folks, and when Andrew Jackson actually was taking folks from the Black Belt and relocating them here to Texas and Oklahoma, there's a particular understanding. And Andrew Jackson was understood by his contemporaries as a dummy, as a hick, as somebody who didn't know anything. And what do we have in 2017? A New Yorker who is a billionaire, not because of his companies, because of a branding agreement that he had because he made money in the 80s and lost it. Right? And we never talk about this. Now we just get in the panic of the Twitter sphere. And the thing is, what he's allowing us to do is preoccupy ourselves with him when folks are getting hit on the ground. Right? And we're getting touched in a very particular way. Right? And you all got somebody here, and I got to call her name, Sister Ruth Simmons. I'm sorry, I'm messing up. Ruth Simmons, who is, dare I say, the G of G's. Right? This is your president went to Brown University and told those folks at Brown University, you can't get whiter than Brown. Right? If anybody has ever been to Providence, Rhode Island, you can't get whiter than New England. Right? And what she told white folks in New England is that you're going to create a program for reparations. You are going to repatriate the families, the descendants of the families who were kidnapped and stolen and who worked to build this place, Brown University, because Brown University predates the Declaration of Independence. So when Dr. Bonner told me she came to the deck, I'm like, whoa, she in Prairie View A&M. So I'm expecting big things. This is not a game, and she is not playing. So now, when you are actually in this space, there's a particular understanding that comes forward. And I think in so many instances, we don't think about the particular work, and we don't pay attention to the things that are immediate to us. When I drove in this afternoon, I know I drove right through the middle of a black neighborhood, right? On the way here, right off the highway. And the question becomes, and we have to look at names like when y'all call it, and I saw that sign in the entryway, welcome to the hill. And the first thing I said was, if this is the hill, who's at the bottom? And we can't ignore that. It is a critical moment. And many times, HBCUs are located as many of you all are from Atlanta. You go to the SWATs and you see where Morehouse Spelman and the AU Center is, it is right across the street from black folks. The question becomes, is there any connection between that space and those black folks who a majority of them work at that place? The same thing happens where I'm at UIC. We are in the middle of Chicago, and it is one of the hardest schools to get into for students of Chicago public schools. We have systemically excluded them, right? So we right in the middle, buttress between a black and Latino neighborhood. The black population of the University of Illinois at Chicago is 8%. In a city that's almost 40%. In a college that was built for residents of the city. And folks like, Stovall, what you doing? You just got a job. I'm like, me having a gig don't mean I don't point out the injustice. Me having a gig doesn't mean that I don't tell the truth about these things that are happening, because at any given moment, that young person who is standing outside of that gate can at any moment be me. I dare myself to go in front of a cop and say, don't shoot, I got a PhD. In fact, given the age of white supremacy, it might be more impetus for him to shoot me. Right? So now, when we think about that at the crux moment, now all these things like respectability politics go out the window. We're talking about justice. Justice for those who have experienced the injustice, and not us speaking for people and thinking that we are above folks. Because if we know the history of black people, especially black women, one of the things that black women have been committed to since black people has been saving lives. And when we start to actually recognize how they operate in saving those lives, our work changes. Who we talk to changes. And I don't care what fancy degree you got. I don't care how crispy you look today. Right? There's something that happens because in this space, and my grandmother used to tell me, when I first got hired at UIC, she said, do they know who they hired? And my initial response would be, hell no. But to her was like, no ma'am, I do not think they know. And she would say, I don't think they do. And she said, because they don't know, what you gonna do? Right? So my grandmother always had this notion of what is justice? Justice is determined by those who have experienced the injustice. And now when we start to talk about trauma, we have to talk about not a generational trauma, but a historical trauma. And there's a historical trauma that we don't pay attention to. And a lot of times that historical trauma is put into our lives for us just to cope with. We often give young people in schools coping mechanisms. We don't give folks transformative mechanisms to engage those spaces, right? We now talk about this school to prison pipeline. Let's kick that up. If I'm going through a space that is winding me down, I wear a monochromatic uniform. I can get cavity searched. I can get my locker randomly searched. I can be removed and processed by police departments in that place. Am I talking about a school or a prison? I'm talking about those places being the same thing. So we no longer talk about a school to prison pipeline. We're talking about a school and prison nexus. They are the same place for some of our babies. And because they are, what is the commitment to actually change the condition? Because when we talk about wayward youth, or those youth who just won't sit down and just won't conform, that was me, right? Suspended from kindergarten. Real talk, right? The first one I was a little bogus, I ain't gonna lie. But the second one was for correcting a teacher on the word Tyrannosaurus Rex. I'm 45 years old. Why do I know exactly the trauma I experienced 40 years ago? Right? Because in every day, when I developed my distrust for teachers, and every day I was trying to resist me being dehumanized. Every day I walked up in that building, I'm like, nah, I ain't having it today. Right? I got so bad, I was like, you know what? Do us both a favor and call my mama. Right? Because I would rather be any place but here. Right? I would be any place but being told what I'm just like or what's going to happen to me. Right? Until I got into a situation where my 4th grade teacher challenged me to a fight. She says, David Stovall, it's so good to see you. I need you to understand one thing. Boy, I will fight you and I will win. And then in my 8th grade mind, I was like, you know what? She probably will. Right? In my 3rd grade mind. But what she was saying after that moment was, the world wants to do something to you. The world says something about you. It says something about your capacity and ability to do. She said, what will you do to prove them wrong? And for then, I was lit. I was like, school was about proving the world wrong around what they say about black life. Right? And I can articulate that as a fourth grader. Right? So now, when we talk about this space, and I walk into a schoolhouse and I see that baby in the office, the first thing I say is, damn, that's me. Right? And then sometimes I see them, black and brown babies, and they be calm, right? Because they know the drill. And their thing is survive the encounter. If I can get through this, I can be okay, right? But I got to get through this. And you see that adult piece in their face. I work with a group of young teachers, and one of the young folks that I've been working with, who's now he just finished his first year teaching. His fifth graders sat him down at the end of the school year. And they said, Mr. Williams, we need to talk to you. These are 10-year-olds. They said, Mr. Williams, we see the way they treat you. There is no reason for you to be here. You need to leave. They said, we're going to be okay. But we care about you. And you need to leave. These are 10-year-olds. If a 10-year-old can analyze their condition and tell an adult that they're being dehumanized, then what does it say about their brilliance? These were also the same group of 10-year-olds who told my good friend that they were fifth graders since kindergarten. He was the only teacher to stay with them the entire year. They had already been 6 years in, and no one could stay with them for the entire school year. Right? And we think about these stories as these pitiful, awful stories. But I understand those stories as much more collective, as much more part of a system than these individualized instances. Because we can locate these spaces anywhere we go. If I walked right up the street, I could go to some school in Prairie View, walk through Cypress, go to Houston, and find the same thing. The exact same thing. And the question becomes, when people talk about being anti-black, we have to understand that the black body has been historically positioned as the natural site of gratuitous punishment. Now, you think 45 gonna say that in a tweet? But what he will say is something to put you off and just to get you emotionally charged. But now, when you think like organizers, and organizers always say, it's one thing to run your mouth. It is another thing to do the work of justice. And when you do the work of justice, it plays itself out in a very different way. Now, some of you all hear the things in Chicago, right? So every time so for the last year and a half, I come to certain places and then I say I'm from Chicago. And, ooh, oh my God, how did you get on the plane? Right? That's always fun. Oh, you from Chicago, right? And as Chicagoans, we don't wear that necessarily as this place on our chest, but as Chicagoans, we also are parochial, right? So every place I walk into, I'm like, man, I'm trying to find a folk from Chicago. Where they at? Right? I'm always looking like, right? They're going to show up, right? I have to trust and believe they're going to show up, right? And this thing around being that parochial and taking Chicago everywhere you go is connected to, I come from one of the most segregated cities in the world, right? So it's always in the United States, it's 3 cities. Chicago, Boston, and Milwaukee that always oscillate between the most segregated, right? So now we get this narrative in Chicago, and you see this on your feeds, on your news feeds or what have you, and they're talking about gang beefs. It's much more complex than that. Because in a hyper-segregated city, you're not just affiliated with the set, you're affiliated actually by where you live. And these broad allegiances to sets that folks refer to as gangs is not the story. Right? That's something quick that folks can get out on a news bite. But what actually is happening is this hyper-segregation, which turns into wrongful displacement, i.e. gentrification, which actually morphs into engineering conflict between groups. And this is how they do it. Chicago has lost over 200,000 black residents since 2000. Right? The population of Chicago public schools was 42% black in 2000. It is now 34%. Right? For the first time in its history, Chicago has lost almost 40% of its black teachers. Right? And where did they teach? On the south and west sides of the city. Now, here's another way that conflict becomes engineered. In 2013, the city of Chicago closed 49 schools in one summer. It was the largest single set of school closings in the history of the United States. Now, in that space, in a hyper-segregated space, you now cross particular boundaries. And now, and just think about it, let's think about it simply. If I split the room in half, you all are one school, you all are another. I close you all and send everybody to the new school. What happens on the first day? Hella fights. Has anybody ever been in a fight and you don't even know who you fighting? You just swinging. Oh, who am I swinging? I don't even know. Y'all never been in those, right? Think about doing that. In fact, think about doing that 49 times. So now, in some places, rents raise when communities get gentrified. I live in a place called Woodlawn. The Obama Library is about to set up in Woodlawn. Rents have increased almost 30%. Housing prices have increased almost 25%. Who will be able to live there? Right? In the same institution that will not grant a community benefits agreement to make sure that folks in the area have stable employment. Right? Now, that's not 45. That's the Obama Foundation. So now we have to ask these deeper questions. They get nasty. And this thing around gun violence, we have to change the narrative. Because in 2016, there were 762 homicides in Chicago. In 1996, there were almost 800. So now the panic starts to now engineer how people respond to the panic. And now in that response, in the panic moment, you often go to places where there is no conflict. And you say you're being preemptive. The question becomes, who are you being preemptive on? And now how does it manifest itself in a schoolhouse? So now, if you are a young person in these particular conditions, there is a greater chance that you're going to be mad as hell. And I'm not so much concerned about calming the character of that person, because now we got this big push in the country around character education. It's like, who lacks? I'm not one who's going to say that black babies lack character. But what I am going to say is that black babies have been dehumanized. They have been victims of hypersegregation. They live under hypersegregation. They have been gentrified out of places that they know as home. So now, what is the radical project, as Sean Ginwright says, what is the radical project of healing? Now, when you say this kind of radical project, a lot of times, and I'm glad we got science folks in here, because botany uses radicality in a very different way, right? See, a lot of times when you say radical, people always think somebody got a shotgun. Radical just means a growth from the root, right? So now, even when oncologists talk about cancer, they talk about sometimes what is referred to as a radical growth, right? And a radical growth is something that is emanated from the root, right? Also, in agriculture, they often talk about radical growths, right? And the radical growth is one that emanates from the root, and they actually try to emulate in seed production. So if we talk about this radical project, it's one that is flying in the face of the norm. And this norm is one that is predicated on black death. The question becomes, how do you now shift it? And that shifting is very different work. Because that shifting actually has to engage folks who have been thought of, in many cases, and I'll use Chicago as an example, as disposable. That there is nothing to be done with them. And that they have a place for them. Right? But we see the absurdity of this. In the state of Illinois, and I'll give you all this example. You all got a school here that's out by Dallas that does this. There's a school in Illinois, there's a district in Illinois called the New Trier District. New Trier spends about $25,000 per student, per school year. Now, the Illinois Department of Corrections, through the Department of Juvenile Justice, spends $270,000 per year to keep a young person incarcerated. So in a state that has spent $25,000 in its most expensive district, pales in comparison to what it costs to keep a young person incarcerated. Now, the question becomes, what do the young people look like who are incarcerated? What do the young people look like who are in that district that spends the most money? I don't even have to say it for y'all to figure it out. So now, if that's the condition, we have to begin to ask a different set of questions. Because if a state says it's more lucrative or more necessary to spend 4 times as much money than it is to educate them, how quickly do they want them dead? Right? And I don't mince my words around this because the data is on my side. And when I put this claim into being, we have to think about this in a different way because it's not about thinking about those young people who are in those situations are somehow the dregs of society. It's about thinking about those young people in that situation who are under a certain set of conditions. And those conditions can affect folks at any given time. There's a guy named Dart, who's the Cook County Sheriff. He said this thing, and it blows my mind that he says this. Now, he's the Cook County Sheriff who runs the Cook County Jail. He says, I run the largest mental health institution in the world. That's Tom Dart. Right? This is the county sheriff who can say, he says, I can pick 4 people out of any grouping in that space. I pick 2 of them. There's a probability of almost 80% that both of them will be struggling from some mental illness. So it's not mental illness around the inability of black folks and brown folks to maintain, but it's really about understanding what does historical untreated trauma do to people. So now, when we're in places, and again, I don't want y'all to come in tonight and everybody leave depressed as hell, like, damn, Stovall said we all gonna die. Jesus, well, what we gonna do, right? But to really understand the situation, because I'm a firm believer in the more you know, the more you're able to do. And the less it is, the harder it is for you to become manipulated by what is put forward in the grand narrative about us. Right? So if we know this, we won't be manipulated by it. And we can ask questions in anywhere we step into about what is happening. And when we don't have that conversation around what's happening, and are people stumbling at their answers, that's places that we don't necessarily need to be. But the question becomes, how do we begin to create these spaces, right? Because it's not just this gloom and doom. And it's not just the act of resilience, because resilience is the entry point. Now, where is it that we engage in this radical healing, right? And the first point of radical healing is to say that we are deserving of love. One of the hardest things to do, right? I remember I was a young youth worker, and I'm in a meeting, and one of the brothers said to me, Stovall, I love you. What? What you mean, man? I'm hella hot, right? And the masculinity becomes toxic, right? So now this thing around, well, how, and I remember a sister said, well, how do we begin to love each other? Like, what you mean love each other? This struggle. Like, we out here in the street, right? And, I was probably about 19, hella mad, even more excitable than I am now, right? And then and she pulled me to the side. She said, look, it is one thing to say, because, when you're in that age, you hella engaged in the struggle. I die for my people, right? She pulled me to the side. She said, young brother, it is much more important that you live for us. And that's a much harder thing to do. She's like, death is immediate. It can be quick. It can be unnecessary. What does it mean to live for your people? Right? And that's a very different thing. And living means calling out these things that we know to be true. Living means being fearless of the consequences. Because let me guarantee you, it is never, if you're talking about justice work, it is never an issue of if they are coming. It is when they are coming. Right? So I work at a high school. So when I always tease my high schoolers, I was like, look, y'all, when the ops come and they talking about taking me away, just remember we on page 48. Right? And I will be right back. If I'm not back in 3 hours, y'all know who to call. Right? We run it as a drill. Right? So this thing around really understanding that, because when they come for you, the expectation is for you to be fearful of their reprise. Right? But what you have to, and this is why collective spaces become so important. This is the true story, I would argue, of HBCUs. Right? HBCUs, now we talk about the Moral Act of 1896. We talk about the provision of the agricultural and mechanical space in Texas when they created Prairie View A&M. But it was the ingenuity of black folks to say explicitly that this is a place where we're going to claim our humanity and save our lives. Because no one else will do it. Right? To this day, and this is an amazing piece of data at HBCUs, and I just started to see people lift this up. 40% of all black people with 4-year degrees still get them from HBCUs. So now, in that space around understanding what the call is in this, because it's a fraught space, because sometimes you get into this, and sometimes people feel as if because that's something to hold up, that you're trying to create a person to look a particular way, to do things in a particular way. No, we're not talking about clicking up, right, and hating on the next person. We're talking about what it means to say we live in this world and our commitment to justice means that we're going to make a shift. And it is one of the toughest things to do. So what we're talking about in this radical project of resistance is saying, what does it mean to make school relevant? Ask you all a quick question. By a show of hands, who would say they got the majority of their education in school or outside of school? For the folks who say they got the majority of their education inside of a school, raise your hands. Ooh-wee. The people who got your education outside of school, will you please raise your hand? Then what are we doing here? And we get into these spaces and we never think about that in terms of K-12 education, right? We always think school becomes compulsory. It's this mind-numbing thing that's engineered to bore the hell out of you into submission. It is this thing intended to kill you. Right? And we just get through it. Right? I mean, you remember talking to the homies in schools like, look, family, look, all we got to do is third period right now. We got to get to 6. Come on, family, we can do it. We can do it. We can do it. So all we got to do is get out this boy. Look, they coming. Right? So now school is often understood as this place. So there's another thing in the Radical Project, because now when you come to consciousness about what you're actually in, there's a reaction that comes. When you first come to consciousness, the first thing that happens, you are angry as hell. I mean, my students get into this thing like, Stovall, look, I'm just go out on the block and I'm gonna get one. Get who? Right? And it's one of them. One of who? It's like them. And like the people who created this oppression shit. And I'm always like, okay. But if we're going to engage in that political project, we need to be smart about it. Because we're pretty outgunned. Just off top, let's look at it practically. Right? I mean, rubber bands at a F-1 bomber, not a good look. Right? But at the same time, when we are educated, and education meaning the process that we engage to ask critical questions around our condition and the work we do to change that condition, that's a different thing that's harder to stop. They still will attempt to stop it, but it's more difficult. Because that particular commitment, now it becomes more difficult for them to say that you are acting in a nefarious way. They still will try. Because any effort towards black self-determination will be met with that very violent and vehement response. But at the same time, this is why we do it. So now it's not just bringing folks to critical consciousness and bouncing. It's bringing folks to critical consciousness and saying, what is your commitment to make sure that you are with them through this process? So the most important thing in working with young folks and families is your consistency in working with them. And the other thing in the Radical Project of Healing is understanding that the people who we're working with are sources of knowledge to change our condition. It's a different thing to believe that we know what we already need. Ella Baker said this thing, and we often forget the point. And for people who do not know who Ella Baker is, please find out immediately. Ella Baker put forward a challenge to King. She told King, she said, look, brother, we have a problem. And the problem is people are solely looking to you for leadership, and they do not trust themselves to bring what they need. And you have created a dynamic where if they take you out, there is nothing left. Ella Baker put that warning to him. And she said this other thing. She said, we are the ones we have been waiting for. And when she says that, now it changes up. So it's not looking for someone to come out of nowhere and save us. The Radical Project says we have the capacity to save ourselves. We have to create instances where we can do it. Because when we don't, all other things distract us. And that distraction is what I am most concerned about. Because when we are distracted, these things take away. And this thing around, well, Stovall, what are you talking about? Like, look, this thing, and many of us, and let's look at it in a very practical way. By a show of hands, now we just did our education test. Who would say that in K to 12, you had one good teacher? Now, let's ask another question. For you all who had that one good teacher, was that good teacher always in trouble? We got to think about that a little bit. Because that good teacher is less concerned about school and more concerned about education. They are not always the same thing. And when we tell a young person to go to school, sometimes we're telling them to go to a place that dehumanizes them. And sometimes that young person makes an informed decision not to go. I never look at a young person who's not in school as a dropout. They are pushed out before they drop out. They are told that that space is not viable to them, or they have made a conscious decision that that space is not viable to them. Because think about it. Why would you, and I think about my city, if your school is closed, you now are shifted to another school called a receiver school. When you're in that space, sometimes you can be 40 to 45 deep in a classroom, no books. How do I, in good faith, tell a young person to sit through that? Would you? Now let's think about it in real time. So now when that young person goes to the block, that is much more an informed decision than it is them actually rejecting education. Because very few people reject something that's going to improve their condition. We reject things all the time that are irrelevant. We reject things all the time that we know are lies. That Christopher Columbus shit? Can we just talk about that in real time? Dude went the wrong way, called people the wrong name, and he got a holiday. Right? And some of us are like, thanks for the one love for the day out of school, but still pretty bogus. But this thing now, when we start to talk about this, and now we have to ask different questions of ourselves. There is no way we tell the story of Rosa Parks without telling the story of Claudette Colvin. We don't like to say that name. Because when we say Claudette Colvin, that was the woman who actually started the Montgomery bus boycott, but they didn't want her as the figure because she was 8 months pregnant. The radical project of healing means we sometimes have to tell a painful story about ourselves. And I know a lot of folks feel like that's in-house business. And we don't want to put our in-house business in the street. But at the same time, that particular business becomes critical if we understand the annals of history. We don't need to say Rosa Parks without also saying Pauli Murray. And Pauli Murray is the person that they used. They used her legal argument to argue the Brown v. Board of Education case. We never say her name. A book just came out this past summer called Jane Crow about Pauli Murray. Please read the book called The Dark Side of the Street. And it's about black women resisting sexual violence. So now, when we talk about these things, there have been folks since time immemorial who have engaged in this radical project of self-love. We don't necessarily call it that, but we have always engaged in it. And those teachers who we thought to be good teachers, I would dare ask you, they all would say that they loved you. In colleges of education, we run away from love. We tell folks there should be separation between you and the student. You should prove yourself to be the authority figure. In this case, if I'm actually engaged in a larger project of justice, I understand that the students are my comrades in this larger fight for justice. Without them, I do not exist. Right? And then if you show, and my students always say this, if you show love, love will be returned. Right? And this thing around being that explicit, and the radical project of healing says, healing first assumes that we are not broken. I cannot stand these terms. At risk. At risk of what? At risk of telling you that you're bogus? At risk of telling you that this is irrelevant? That's what students are at risk of, right? Or This other one, underprivileged. What are we talking about? Right? A young person is actually able to survive under particular conditions. They are resilient, not underprivileged. Right? So if we want to talk about it, now let's talk about someone who is actually experiencing and resisting dehumanization, genocide, wrongful land appropriation. But see, that got too many syllables for the news feed. So now, when we talk about this particular work, it's about shifting our analysis of this. And then dare say that we love ourselves in this process. And I say this as a 45-year-old who struggles with this. Right? Because again, when people are saying stuff like, we got to engage in, and people say this term, and I remember I used to resist it when people would say like self-care. Like, what you mean self-care? It's the struggle. And one of the homies like sat me down, he was like, fool, you better take your ass in that yoga. He was like, look, sun salute, all that shit it changed your life. Right? So you better eat them greens, homie. Right? Not the ones that are cooked up with all, like, no, real greens untouched. You better eat that, bro. So you better pay attention to what's going inside your body, because if it doesn't come out, it's not good. All right? I'll save you all the sordid details. Right? But I had a doctor tell me 6 years ago. I went into the doctor's office and I woke up one morning and, for folks who do first aid and medicine, what have you, they tell you to do this. Like if you're having a heart attack, they tell you to cough, right? So I get up in the morning, I'm feeling this pain in my chest and I'm twisting my arm, I'm coughing, I'm grabbing I'm like, damn. All right, so I'm not having a heart attack, but something is happening in my chest. So I go to the doctor and the doctor said something blew me away. He said, take me through your day. I was like, oh, shit. Like, I literally said that when I was like, ooh, this ain't good. And then he said, So I took him through my day, talked to him all the stuff I was doing. He said, wow, that's a whole lot. It will really be nice if you get to 50. And then he told me that I had a pre-existing condition. He said it was a advanced form of acid reflux that if I didn't treat it, became a thing called Barrett syndrome, which is the precondition for esophageal cancer. All right? And he said, look, I don't even have to treat this medically. You can change up how you live to treat it, but you have to change what you do. I was like, dang. But even in that point, I was like, but you know what? If I go off this, I still die for the struggle. I mean, it just becomes to the point of absentia, right? You're just like, man, look, I'm dying for the struggle. I even got this acid reflux. It's still gonna kill me, but it's for the struggle. Right? But this thing around now, it pushed me back to 20 years before when one of my comrades told me, yeah, you think that's cute, but it's much harder to live. And it's much harder to live in the name of justice. Because people want you to slip, people want you to look in a particular light, and you have to fight that. But you cannot fight that individually. You must fight that collectively. So the Radical Project of Healing means that we cannot do this by ourselves. Let us get rid of the Hollywood narrative of some random white woman coming into a classroom with a bunch of black and brown babies with a notebook saying, all you have to do is write. That's a lie. But what it does say is the Justice Project is hard work. It's harder than we think. And it's going to ask deeper questions of us. And it's going to ask us to think about our work in a way that we have not entertained. And when we do that, the results are different. Right? And now, when we see it in that way, it changes up how we move in the world. But you actually have to engage it. And then the other thing around the Radical Project of Healing, defeat and failure are often part of it. And now how do we engage, or as a good friend of mine, a mentor says, how do we embrace the failure? And we embrace the failure in ways that now lift us up. Right? I've learned from working with young folks, and a group of young folks that I work with now, they always say, you know, Stovall, when the times get tough, we need to hold each other. They didn't say hold each other accountable, but they said hold each other. Literally to have a presence to tell you that it is going to be all right. Right? When you're trained as a first responder, and if somebody has experienced what they call blunt force trauma, they always tell you to do two things. Make eye contact, maintain eye contact, and say, everything is going to be all right. I need you to be with me. And a good friend of mine starts his classroom every day with that statement. It's good to see you. Some nights may have been rough. Last night may have been rough. The most important thing is that we are in each other's face. We have work to do. I will never run from you. I will always support you. And think about that if you had that in a classroom every day with a teacher that actually did it. So the Radical Project is not something far off. The Radical Project of Healing is something that people have been doing. The Radical Project poses a challenge that we now must return to that collective spirit. Not that the days of old were better, they were different. And now, because America has proven itself to be the same thing, we have to remember that work, right? So I hate to say things to young folks because I think it's the most lame thing that we can say to you all, right? You all are the future. You right now. Something is happening right now, right? And I got to trust in your capacity to work with you because this thing is happening right now. I am in a city where a mayor covered up a murder to win an election. All you have to do is look at the story of Laquan McDonald. So now he also said that he would not spend money on a district where 25% of the students are going to do nothing with their lives anyway. That's the mayor. So yeah, young folks in Chicago are woke. Crunk up woke. And that thing that they're saying is, and people don't think about Kendrick Lamar's song All Right being the project of radical healing. But I mean, that statement is heavy to me. Literally, y'all, when Trump, I won't even say 45, Trump tried to do a rally in Chicago. And everybody was like, is he for real? I mean, it was wild, right? 15,000 people showed up who were not for Trump. They beasted the arena, which is right next to the parking lot of my building, right? And my students, they sending me the live feeds. They're like, Stovall, this ain't happening, right? And I see this group of young people walking into the arena, and they're singing Kendrick Lamar's "We Gonna Be All Right." I couldn't stop myself from crying. All I thought about was Fannie Lou Hamer. When Fannie Lou Hamer used to sing those songs, those codes that black folks had made to secure their lives, the message was, we gonna be all right. I'm like, man, and my wife was looking at me. She was like, what is happening? I was like, man, I understand it. I didn't have to sit them down for a 3-hour lecture. All they did was claim their humanity. And it was a group of 7th graders, right? And they walking into the room and they say, we gonna be all right, right? And I'm like, whoa. But that's the Radical Project. But the idea is not to leave it there. So once I've seen that, what is my commitment to those young folks? Am I going to give them bogus history? Am I going to continue to feed the lie? That same group of 7th graders stood outside the juvenile justice facility in Chicago. And they had bullhorns. And they're speaking through the bullhorns. We know what's happening to you. We know that you're suffering from the same conditions that we suffer from. We are here to hold you, to make sure that you know that you're loved. One of the 7th graders caught in the camera a group of young folks in the juvenile detention center who got in each other's, one of them stepped in each other's hands, and he wrote on the window, "We love you." And I wasn't even crying, I was leaking. Right? But those young folks said, "We love you." Right? And who actually supported them in that work? Right? It was a teacher named Paige May who said, here's how we change that condition. And we want folks to know that it's not, I don't want to bring you here to the juvenile detention center so you can fear it. I want you to understand what it is. Because if you know what it is, there's less chance that you will have contact with it or will be manipulated or victimized by it. So let me check in with y'all. Is this making sense? Because I say these things not as an expert. I say these things as a struggling educator who does not always have the answers, who sometimes fails miserably in my work. But I believe in this capacity, and I have committed myself to do this work in a particular way. I know everyone does not agree with it. That is not the issue. But if I understand solidarity, solidarity means we do not always have to disagree. We do not always have to agree. But we are committed to doing this work, and when we do this work, we will hold each other in very serious times. 45 cannot defeat that. I promise you. So with that, thank y'all so much for having me. Hopefully my verbal diarrhea hasn't gone too crazy and I haven't just been talking nonsense. So thank y'all again for having me. I truly appreciate it. And whoa, wow. Man. Thank y'all. And we set up a little time to engage a Q&A, because I know, again, my random trepidations or what have you can get a little funky. But if folks have questions, let's engage in a dialogue or a staring contest, whichever one comes first.
If you have a question, can you come to the front so that the people on the live stream can see? Mm-hmm. Did that make everybody not have questions?
Right. No, I'd be like, we was just playing.
If you feel more comfortable calling them out, call. Is there one? Oh, yes. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much. This has been really, we talked earlier when you came in that I said to you that I wish I were surprised at what's happening today, but I know better. But I wish I were surprised, but I know better than to be surprised. I was looking at Rothstein's new book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. You're very familiar with that because some of this took place in terms of real estate and what was going on in Chicago. If you accept that theorem, then can we at all expect the federal government to really take any kind of position to there be a role that where this, it's very, usually your enemy or whatever can't fix you. Doesn't have any interest in it. So I'm wondering, do you think there's going to be any kind of reversal, any kind of change, anything that can happen at the federal level. If not, then what is the real answer?
Right. I mean, well,
What
the
happens?
thing, and thank you for that, because I think the answer isn't necessarily a direct answer like as we would think, right? Because we also have to consider all these different layers. But I do think that when we talk about what can be the expectation of the federal government, the only thing that the federal government is really designed to do is for people to push it to be accountable, right? And that's a hard fight. And that's a fight that is often lost. And at the same time, and the first thing I think about, because Roth talks about cities, but actually there was a disinvestment in black farmers, right? So that coincided with cities, right? So black farmers were disinvested in, and they never received loans that folks in middle America received. So that thing around, so you had the black farmers, the group of black farmers were actually disinvested by the federal government, right? And that was after Reconstruction which was supposed to be the first type of repatriation. So this thing around, to your question, I think that push will be around holding the government accountable and then pushing for, and it's not just protesting that you don't have, but it's actually coming with those particular plans and saying this is what is possible and what can be done. And it's a different fight, but also a hard one, and people have engaged with some sense of victory. But again, it's that piece around really, because governments are responsive entities, and now the way they're set up, they respond to certain things, and now that's big capital in the form of corporations, largely corporations. But now the thing that shifts that, especially at the local level, right? Local elections become important because now at the local level, people have access to that particular set of land. And we've seen that in Chicago, where people have held fast to stuff like zoning, to make sure that zoning makes sure that commercial development cannot encroach on residential development. But that's a difficult piece, but an important fight, because I think that thing around how do you hold folks accountable, but at the same time now begin to build out your own, right? And even that's met with pretty vehemently. But I think that thing around really looking at that per locale and saying, what is it that folks need in that space? And now holding folks accountable to it. But it's not just the government, but it will also have to be that undercurrent where we have capacity to build that, right? In terms of what it is that we want.
Other questions? I'll get this one, then I'll come back to you.
First off, thank you for joining us here at Prairie View, Dr. Stovall. I'm a student here at Prairie View, and I'm a busy man. What can I do? Other students here at Prairie View, but what can we do to help you in the Radical Project?
Right. And I think that's the thing around. Thank you for that, because the Radical Project is not one necessarily where we're helping folks, because help in the broader sense becomes temporary, right? It's just this kind of thing where folks need temporary assistance. You go in, take care of that, and then go around. But now what we're talking about is sustained, protracted struggle, right? And that's different. So now, if folks are moving in the world, if folks have things to do, a good friend of mine, Cesare Warren, he always says, and I love his statement around this. He says, find your revolutionary act. Said it doesn't have to be these broad scale things, right? It can be in your house, right? It can be with your family, right? This thing around what are the spaces that actually bring about you changing the condition, and where do we identify that, right? And then when we identify that space, how do we go into that space humbly, right? Because a lot of times we can go into the space with this kind of all-knowing thing. If we are engaging in the Radical Project, the first thing is to say we have much more to learn than to give immediately. right? And this thing around, so what are we willing to learn, right? And then for what purpose, right? Why are we doing this thing, right? And this thing around now shifting what we think to be beneficial, but now saying, okay, what does this mean for the long term, right? And that's a very different type of piece because, we all got stuff happening in the world, right? But now, where are the spaces where we can be consistent, right, in doing this work? And that takes a little more thinking, I would argue, right? Because we can do these projects, right? So we can do a quick project, I always used to trip out on that thing, alternative spring break, right? Where folks would go some random place, do a little something, boom, 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 and then write it on your resume. This is not about resume writing, right? This thing is about what are we doing long term with folks, right? And now based on what they have identified as the issues. That's a very different thing, right? Because it's not, we can't come in as the justice warrior knowing, right? It's really around, okay, what are folks talking about? How are folks understanding this? What are people saying that they need? Now, how do we start to build that out? Right? How do we work with folks with that understanding, right? And you always see this community-minded principals think about this very differently with schools. Because they don't go into schools and say, well, this is a dropout factory, blah, blah, blah. They say, well, this is a space that's been historically disinvested. How do we get the resources to address the issues and concerns that families have been saying in time memorial? And that's a very different approach because now the project of listening becomes the pathway by which to engage. It's not coming in as the expert, right? Because expertise is just like this PhD thing, right? PhD just means you wrote a long thing about something little. That's all it is. I promise you, right? So when you get that degree, you are saying you wrote a long thing about a little thing. You are not necessarily an expert, right? So that thing around really being clear about that, right? So that the Radical Project is thinking about this is actually a reframing of how we think about justice work. Mm-hmm. We got one right here. We'll come over this way. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
How you doing, Dr. Stovall? My name is Henry Darnell. I'm an interdisciplinary studies major. We try to go into certified teaching. You mentioned before about the closure of schools. And, I saw that happen in my neighborhood. They closed down Lamarck ISD. And now it got picked into Ted City ISD, which usually isn't, it's really separated in the, in both of them. And now they're bringing them together. Far as, my question is, I see that, there's only 2% of educators that are black males. And there's not really that many blacks in general that are educators. What can I do, or what can an educator do in their neighborhood, not necessarily, in the school, in their neighborhood, and what can a community do far as when their school, district gets closed down or anything of that nature?
Right. So let me go backwards to let me go with your last question first. So a lot of times when schools are being closed, that's a community struggle, right? So it's this thing around what is the rationale for the closure and holding state bodies accountable around this, right? So saying, why is this place being closed and what's this rationale around underperforming? And then when you start to dig a little deeper, this actually comes into a space where the data will show why it's been closed or what's the rationale for its closure. Now, the first question, and this is going to sound very mundane, but when you talk about getting folks in the teaching force and what can we do to actually shift that narrative, be a good teacher, right? And demonstrate your capacity, because in teaching we often talk about modeling, right? So if a young person can see an example of what it means to actually engage and love them in a way that is now challenging them to do work collaboratively to change the condition, they're much more attuned to engage that process with you, right? So this thing around so the recruitment is your pedagogy and practice in the classroom, right? And oftentimes we don't think about that. Oftentimes we think about this broad-based program that's supposed to drop into, and now you have changed the black teaching force, but we got to do it on a number of different ways. And one of those ways is to actually engage in that practice, right? In ways that run counterintuitive to what we've been told in colleges of education oftentimes, right? Because I work at a college of education, and many colleges of education suffer with this. We're stuck in 1850, right? In terms of how and this bogus dance, scope, sequence, classroom management, it's awful. I mean, it's god-awful terrible, right? And the teachers that we know who have written for us and actually have gone to the table for us, they engage very little of that, right? And now, this way, classroom management is devoid in how it's taught. It's devoid of love, right? So this thing around what does it mean to engage in challenge, because young folks, because when we say this, people think that our classroom is supposed to be these free-for-alls, right? Young folks will appreciate structure, but it has to be structure for a purpose, right? We cannot, because I said so, just ain't cracking. And nor should it have ever been cracking, right? Because literally, when we say that as adults, what the undercurrent of that is really, we don't know. Right? So we telling you because I said so, because I don't want to look stupid because I don't know. Right? So now we have to rethink that, right? And in rethinking,
can you adjust your necklace a little bit?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So now that thing around rethinking that, right? In terms of getting out of that space and saying, what does it mean to engage that larger justice project? Because a larger justice project says that dehumanization of those young folks is normal, right, and good. You have to say, no, it's not. And the third thing, you now have to find those who will affirm your sanity. You cannot do this by yourself. Whatever building you step into, there is somebody who knows what they're doing. Your job on day one is to find them, right? And you got to build with them because they know that community, they know the politics of place, they know how that school operates. You got to find them, and you got to build spaces with them. And one of the things that you say, I'm new, I'm trying to learn, and I'm trying to be here for these folks, for these young folks that I care about. Because the next thing they're going to tell you, I prove it. Right, and that's where that's the starting point, right? Not the end point, right? Not as we saying educational psychology, the developmental end. The start, right? So when we start from that point, now it shifts how we engage, right? And don't be as worrisome about the bad days, right? So when those homicidal thoughts come. It is okay. The work is not to have those homicidal thoughts days in a row. Right? I mean, that's just if we think about it practically, right? But I think those things become important. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I've had experience over the years with STEM.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm disappointed.
Yes.
I think STEM is another one of the shams to throw us off. And I feel that it should be STREAM, STREAM, because we need to get back to reading, and we need to get back to agriculture. So because we are getting away. This STEM is all technology, and it's throwing the kids off, and it's hard to try to convince people that it's not a good program. it's a good program, but it's not a good program. So,
I think with the piece around STEM, and some people even talk about STEAM, right, in terms of bringing art into the equation. I think the real thing is, and to your point, is really around what is the express need of the young folks, right? So and that takes a different level of listening, right? Because at one point, some of y'all remember this movement where it was like urban agriculture was a solution to everything, right? And that's not necessarily the case. And we often think about youth development as this linear thing, right? But we never really, and when people talk about school choice, there is very little choice in it, right? And it's really giving folks the choice of some really bad options, right? Where resources are hoarded to other places. So this thing around, so now if we engage in this listening and it's counseling in a very different way, right? So think about a school if we said, all right, what are you interested in? And then the next question, based on your interests, what do you think, or based on your observations, what does a community need? And can we match them? Right? And and I've seen folks counsel like that, right? Engage in counseling projects like that, because this thing around, because it gets sold to folks, because we see this in Chicago. So a lot of STEM programs that serve Black and Latino youth, they all put folks in these data entry jobs, right? With no upward mobility in them at all, right? So now to reverse that, saying, okay, well, what is the pathway for us to now do this work while also addressing a community need, right? And that's a very different way, because this is always the trouble with K-12 schooling. I won't even say education, but K-12 schooling, everybody wants to bring these things to scale. And that's the problem, right? Schools are universes to themselves, right? So now bringing this thing to scale, what works in one place is never guaranteed to work in another, right? And I think that's the most difficult thing for people to grapple with in terms of K-12 schooling, because like I said, this stuff can be a sham as quick as it's rolled off to some space. And again, families get duped with these trinkets. Like you all can look up this school in Chicago called Uno Soccer Academy, right? And it's just UNO. And when you go up to it, it looks like an eagle. I mean, it looks like a metal eagle coming out the ground. Now, think about a fourth and fifth grader riding a bike up to that school. Where are you trying to go to school? The eagle looking thing. I mean, just think about it practically. This thing's like an eagle. And you ride up to it, you and the homies on the bike in the summer, and you're like, man, I'm going to that eagle school? Yeah, that's what we on, right? But at the eagle school, they dress you up like the young folks in public schools in Mexico City, right? They got you in the red, white, and blue little joints, the little bandolero, little piece. They do the family thing, got the mariachi band cracking. They got all this stuff happening. They do the whole open house in Spanish. But then when you start day one, it's an English only policy. So now you are essentially being schooled to hate your mama, right? To devalue the language that you bring into the space, and now reject it when you go home. What are we doing, right? But they got this eagle-looking building that folks want to go to just off top, right? And we do it in Black neighborhoods too. Get a whole incoming freshman class iPads, right? Whole little trinkets. Then you go into the spot, you got to walk on lines with your hands behind your back, right? They don't start class until you're in the frisk position. And you're just like, come on, y'all, for real. This is forward as discipline. That's dehumanization. That's saying you will only reap the benefits of this place unless you succumb to the order in which we put forward. Right? You need to never remind us that we're treating you like a prisoner. Because the moment we do, you out of here. Right? And we've even set it up with contracts. Right? They got these contractual they even have a space in some charter schools that they call it a non-disciplinary dismissal, right? And all that means is if you have 2 consecutive Fs, you're automatically removed from the rolls because your contract as the charter with the city is that you'll keep test scores at a certain level, right? And the question is, who is bearing the brunt of this, right? Those are poor black and brown families, period. So now when we start to pull that out, it changes it up. But again, that thing, so it goes back to this earlier question. So when we have community questions, when they come to us, that say, what does this mean? What is your disciplinary policy? What is this policy? What is this contractual arrangement that parents are signing? Do you do that to white students? And they go, right? So to put this thing around, really, to your point, how we look at those things and are able to cipher through them, right? And I think that's a critically important point that now allows us to look at K-12 schooling very differently, right? Because those agriculture plans, like I met these young folks, it was like, yeah, man, we getting fake food on the block, we want to grow our own. Word, right? We got a whole plot of land right next door to get down, right? But that thing around, that only came by a deep listening to those young folks, right? That now allows folks to think about it differently. Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is going to be our last question in the question and answer.
How y'all doing? My name is Raymond Jackson. I'm a transfer from a PWI. I'm studying criminal justice with a specialization in juvenile justice. Coming from the PWI, I don't compare to my HBCU. You know, I have a problem with my HBCU too, though, right? So my first question is, I question everything. Like you talked about, when you become conscious and you wake up, you get mad. I'm mad at some of my professors. I'm mad that I'm at an HBCU, but when I research all my authors of the books we learning from, they all white. Understanding we living in a white America, how do you conduct yourself from your own personal experience? You said that you have a problem with being uninvited to places, but we need this word from you and people like you. So from your own personal experience, what would you do different, or what would you have done different to put yourself on a bigger stage?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah. Well, that thing, I think to your question, because I think about your question in a couple of ways. To the first part, what would I do different? Absolutely nothing. And this is why I say this. And not as pejoratively. But this thing around, when we talk about, when we say things like being our true and authentic selves, that is a very different, I always think about that as a justice claim, right? So when we operate as our true and authentic selves, that is a justice claim, right? Because it's not so much, and I think about myself as, I think about this in humility, right? So if I can get into a classroom space where folks are actually engaging this, grappling with it, struggling with it, then I'm trusting in and they're seeing me out in the world, I'm trusting in their capacity to go out and do the same thing. That is another thing that comes up with that. I also have to support their capacity in doing the same thing, right? And I think that's a little bit different, right, in terms of, and I'd say this because this is how it was showed to me by, like, you think about this thing, it's interesting, I had this experience as a young person in graduate school. Think about if you walk in the hallways and a department head comes in the hallway and says, Stovall, can't let them win. When you volunteer for bullshit, they win. And they're winning. And he just walks away. Right? That was every day. And I'd be like, damn, doc, this is... But it became tattooed in my head. Like, when we volunteer for the madness, they win. Right? And now we need to understand that space. And there's a whole, to your first point, two of my friends posed a challenge to folks in the academy. They said, for the next 3 journal articles you write, do not quote a white author. Folks, what do you mean? No Wittgenstein? No. Right? And this is the thing, because it's not a scrape on white folks, but it's understanding white supremacy is not white racial terror. And we equate the two as the same thing, right? And what I mean, so white terror and violence is one component of white supremacy. White supremacy should be understood as the assumed views and values of white, Western European descended, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied males as normal, right, and good, right? And when we think about that structurally, now how do we begin to grapple with it and also reject it, right? Because now that white supremacist frame often leads to our deficit, because in juvenile justice, so a lot of the juvenile justice stuff comes from youth development. Youth development work came from the study of white kids in the suburbs. What the hell does that have to do with the west and south side of Chicago? Right? Absolutely nothing. Right? So we have to name that. Right? And I think I think the challenge is right and exact. Right? When we got these, and real talk, most of these textbooks are terrible. Right? And we read them and you're just like, what? Like, how many of y'all has the experience? You read something in class, you say, there's no way in hell this is going to work. But I was like, who got paid? And all I'm saying, I was like, who got paid to write this? Like, who got dough to write this, right? And it's on the 7th edition. Right? You just got to tell it. It's on the 7th edition, some madness. Right? They done got paid 7 times to write this. Right? So this thing around how do we now, we stand in that challenge, because I think that's a real thing. Now, there's another piece to this. There's a trilingualism in this, right? And one of my homies would always say this. We have to be, the Justice Project, or the Radical Project of Healing and Justice, says that we have to be trilingual in our work. And what does that mean? Trilingualism is saying, what is it that the world is saying? What are we trying to say? And then how are we trying to communicate it? Right? And that's always the work, because we're translators as much as we are purveyors of the justice condition, right? And saying, okay, this stuff doesn't make sense. Most of it doesn't make sense for a reason, to further confuse us, right? And who are those people whose work we respect and actually start to think about in a very different way, right? So I started these black feminists they were challenging me on, like, look, you reading up, so I got supercharged on this book called The Undercommons, right? It's dude Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. So I'm reading it, I'm like, yo, and I'm going back to the OGs. I'm like, man, look, I'm reading this Undercommons, this the coldest thing. Woman named Beth Ritchie. Beth Ritchie has the most beautiful and eloquent way of telling you to go fuck yourself. And she said this thing to me. She said, David, it is amazing to me how the work of black women is now equated to a book you just read. And I was just like, oh. I was like, I just got the ugly stick, right? I'm like, right? And she said, if you're going to read, and she knows them, right? So if you're going to read Stefano and Fred, how about read some Toni Cade Bambara first? Right? She's like, how about read some Audre Lorde first? Yeah. Right? And I'm reading it and I'm like, damn. Right? And my first thing is like, they stole it. Right? I'm like, this is thievery. Right? But this thing around how we now position that, right? Because it's really around us challenging ourselves to now think about our work differently. But we have a whole historical lineage of people who have thought about this work differently, right? So when folks start talking about Dr. King, always think about a theologian that he used to read, right? And when you start to think about his work, or when you start to read like Richard Cohn, who was a contemporary of King, right? And Richard Cohn talked about a black theology of liberation, right? And this is mid-60s, right? So this thing around looking at those spaces. Like when Barbara Ransby wrote that biography of Ella Baker, right? When you see how Ella Baker communicated with folks, right? And what she was saying, and then how folks like Stokely Carmichael, James Foreman, talk about that work, right? Or Daisy Bates, right? Gwen Patton, right? These folks who have been excluded largely from the historical record, but have now been reclaimed, right? I mean, this even goes to music, right? We think about rock guitar and Jimi Hendrix. We don't even talk about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, right here in Texas, right? So this thing around how we start to think about that in ways that challenge our understandings, right? Because, and I think that's and look for the people, and this is the thing that we lie to you all as professors. The biggest lie that we tell you all as students is that this hasn't been done before. All that means is we ain't ready. Let's let the cat out the bag. That's all that means, right? So when you come to the table with the new Jones, we got to look at that and go, oh, okay. Because what that shows to me is that you're dedicated to understanding what this is, right? The Justice Project means I can't desert you. My commitment is to support you, right? So keep that challenge up, because this is the thing. I mean, you will have that isolating moment, but there will be the folks who hold you who will be the wherewithal for you to withstand this, right? Because this thing, the Justice Project, is also a project of longevity and perseverance, right? Notice I didn't say the new slick words that people trying to talk about, grit. More pathology on black and brown folks, right? I mean, it's just, and Duckworth got a shit ton of money to study this, right? And all she is really saying, but now it's pathology. So if a person doesn't exemplify these particular attributes of grit, they're not worth our time, right? So this thing around really, how do we begin to ask questions? Because it's not hating on it, but it's saying we have to be very careful about our work, that we don't succumb to the pathologies that have actually further marginalized us, right? The Justice Project says we got to ask deeper questions. Those questions are generated by us listening, right? And now creating from what we're hearing, right? Thank you all again.
Join me in thanking Dr. Stovall. Dr. Bonner, can you come to the stage? Yes. We got a gift. So on behalf of Mach 3 and Prairie View, we'd like to thank you for being here and being our featured speaker at the Building on Resilience lecture series.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Truly appreciate it.
And they're gonna pose for the picture, Dr. Bonner. And so we also wanted to recognize and thank some other staples at Prairie View. So Dean Metcalf Turner, I know she was here, and also Dr. Thomas Smith, who asked a question, our former provost, and the Associate VP for Student Affairs. Thank you for being here and supporting us. Steve Ransom. You want me to close this out? Yeah. Okay. So let's give Dr. Stovall another round of applause. My mind is blown. I can't even read my script. I'm just excited. So thank you all for being here tonight. We couldn't have had such an amazing event without all of you. Please be sure that you signed in or RSVP'd for the event so that we can email you information about future events. And this concludes our program. Have a wonderful night.